The first sound was the sharp metallic crack echoing across my front field, followed by a voice as shrill as a car alarm. "Cut the lock." I looked up from my workbench to see a small crowd in neon vests and dark sunglasses swarming through my shattered front gate under the blistering midday sun. 3 trucks branded with community compliance on the doors barricaded my driveway as if I were a fugitive. Cameras whirred. Clipboard-toting neighbors shouted commands. Dust clouds choked the air. I set my wrench down and walked slowly to the porch, observing them trample my land with an air of ownership. The ringleader, Patricia Pat Whitmore, her face flushed with self-righteous fury, pointed a trembling finger at me. "This area is under an official neighborhood review." I didn't move. I simply offered a faint, knowing smile. "Are you certain you have the proper authority here?" Because just 50 feet away, behind the barn door, the county sheriff himself was seated at my kitchen table, sipping his morning brew, completely unaware that a suburban militia had just breached the perimeter of his jurisdiction. Before we dive into this incredible confrontation, tell me where you're watching from and the time in your area. Make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss how this all concludes. Many believe residing next to a managed community guarantees tranquility and manicured lawns. I once shared that belief until I encountered Pat Whitmore. I purchased this land 15 years ago, 20 acres of serene countryside just beyond the border of an upscale suburban enclave named Sycamore Glen. I built my farmhouse in a red barn with my own hands, planted my fields, and raised a few horses. Life was uncomplicated. I enjoyed the liberty to live as I pleased. No board meetings, no association fees, and certainly no one mandating the color of my mailbox. But Pat had a different vision. She moved into the subdivision about 4 years back and instantly ascended to the presidency of the neighborhood council. You know the type. Crisp blazers, a perpetually clutched clipboard, convinced of her sovereign rule over the territory. The woman was a hybrid of a parking enforcement officer and a despot with a home-decorating blog. Her first visit to my property line involved a complaint that my horses emitted an odor offensive to the community's ambience. I courteously informed her, "Ma'am, this is a farm. The center detecting is commonly referred to as nature." That did not land well. From that day forward, it became her personal crusade to bring me to heel. My mailbox filled with letters accusing me of unauthorized livestock and non-conforming landscaping. One even claimed I was violating community visual standards because my barn wasn't painted a neutral sand tone to match the HOA homes. Beige. The idea of painting a working barn beige was absurd. Every week brought a new envelope, all signed by the Neighborhood Standards Committee, a grandiose title for Pat and her friends with excessive free time. Initially, I disregarded them. Then she began mailing fabricated fines, printed from a home computer and adorned with an official-looking seal she likely designed online. I contacted the county clerk's office. They chuckled. My land had been zoned for agriculture for half a century, long before that neighborhood council was even conceived. I was entirely outside their domain. I could have constructed a 10-story chicken palace if I wished, and Pat would be powerless to stop it. But she did not appreciate rejection. She escalated. One morning, she arrived with 2 of her compliance officers to photograph my fence, declaring it non-compliant. I politely requested they depart or I would contact the sheriff. They scoffed, likely assuming I was posturing. That was the day I actually made the call. Sheriff Tom Riggs, an old friend from my school days, arrived 20 minutes later. Tom and I had history. He pursued law enforcement. I went into construction before retiring early to establish this farm. He was a man who believed in fairness and statute, not suburban politics. When his cruiser pulled up that day, the expression on Pat's face was priceless. She attempted to baffle him with jargon, thrusting neighborhood covenants in his direction. Tom reviewed them calmly, handed them back, and stated, "Ma'am, these aren't legally binding beyond your own fence lines." From that moment, Pat viewed him as my accomplice. Weeks passed, and I hoped she'd finally relented. But Pat was a person who craved control. If she couldn't obtain it, she would manufacture chaos. She began circulating rumors, telling people I was operating an unlicensed salvage yard, storing hazardous materials, or worse, cultivating illicit crops behind my barn. Some neighbors believed her, others did not. But she had assembled a following, a petite neighborhood council army of individuals who enjoyed a sense of importance. Then one Friday morning, she committed her most significant error. Sheriff Riggs called me, explaining he required a discreet location for the weekend. He was overseeing a county investigation into stolen farm equipment, and my property was an ideal spot to station an unmarked vehicle for surveillance. I asked no questions. I trusted him. We arranged a cot in the guest quarters beside my barn, and he mentioned he would be maintaining a low profile, reviewing documents and monitoring the area. That very afternoon, I observed Pat driving by, slowing her vehicle at my front gate, snapping photographs as if on a critical mission. Unbeknownst to me, in her mind, this was the final provocation. She must have spotted the sheriff's discreet SUV and believed she had uncovered evidence of her imagined infractions. The following day, a notice was affixed to my gate. Emergency neighborhood safety inspection to be conducted immediately. Failure to comply may result in legal action. Legal action from a council that held no governance over my land. I laughed aloud, but an instinct warned me, do not underestimate this. Pat wasn't merely irritating, she was hazardous when feeling empowered. So I did what I always do before a storm. I prepared. I verified my perimeter cameras, ensured the security system was recording, and charged the backup batteries. I even positioned one camera facing the main gate, zoomed out for a wide angle just in case she attempted something audacious. Sheriff Riggs saw the notice that evening and let out a dry chuckle. "She's truly courting disaster, Mike," he remarked, sipping coffee on my porch. "Yeah," I replied, "but this time she might just receive it." We reminisced about old times, fixing up cars, the foolish stunts we pulled as teenagers. It was surreal sitting there amidst the peaceful fields, knowing turmoil was approaching, yet scarcely believing it would truly arrive. But it did. The next morning, just past noon, I heard the distinct rumble of multiple engines. I glanced up from my barn workbench to see a convoy of white trucks turning dust down the gravel lane. The neighborhood compliance team had arrived in full suburban regalia. Each truck bore the Sycamore Glen insignia on its door as if it signified authority. Men in reflective vests disembarked, clutching clipboards, radios, and cameras. And in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle sat Pat Whitmore, posture rigid, her lipstick a vivid slash of color visible from 50 yards. Sheriff Riggs was inside the guest quarters, quietly reviewing case files. He was oblivious to the scene unfolding outside. I stepped onto the porch, feeling the familiar heat of frustration in my chest mixed with curiosity. What was her objective this time? She couldn't sue me, couldn't find me, so what did she believe this theatrical procession would achieve? The truck screeched to a halt. Pat emerged, holding a binder thicker than a metropolitan phone book. "Mr. Thompson," she shouted across the field. "This is an official neighborhood safety inspection." I could see neighbors gathering along the fence line, phones in hand, capturing the drama under the sweltering afternoon sun. My dogs barked from the backyard. The wind picked up. That's when I understood. She hadn't come for a discussion. She had come for a spectacle. She intended to publicly humiliate me, to make an example of the man who refused to submit. I leaned against the porch rail, wiped sweat from my brow, and offered a faint smile. "You're trespassing, Pat," I stated, calm and steady. She ignored me, turning to her team. "Record this. We're documenting evidence of noncompliance." I almost felt pity for her, almost, because in a few moments she was about to discover that the entity she was challenging wasn't me. It was the law itself. If there was one thing I learned about Pat Whitmore, it's that she could not endure defeat. The woman could escalate a bird feeder violation into a federal case if it deviated from community guidelines. Having ignored her counterfeit inspection notices, she had now activated full crusader mode. After the humiliating standoff at my fence, I assumed she might retreat. Perhaps she would recognize her lack of jurisdiction and move on, but I had underestimated her addiction to control and the lengths she would traverse to reclaim it. 2 days later, my neighbor Linda, one of the few rational residents remaining in that association, stopped by while I tended to the horses. She appeared uneasy. "Mike," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "You should know Pat is hosting an emergency meeting at her house tonight. She says it's about you." I laughed. "About me? What now? Am I violating their sunlight allocation?" Linda didn't smile. "She's discussing deploying the compliance team. She claims you're concealing something on your property. She even mentioned contacting Channel 7 News." That gave me pause. "She's serious?" Linda nodded, deadly serious. "She stated she's going to expose your illegal operations for the community's welfare." I thanked her, watching as she hurried down the dirt road. My mind churned. I wasn't overly concerned. Neighborhood compliance held no law enforcement power. They were merely retirees in polo shirts role-playing as special agents. The peril wasn't their authority, it was their hubris. They genuinely believed their actions were righteous. And a mob with a cause, however absurd, can become perilous swiftly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the fields, I poured a coffee and sat on the porch swing contemplating. Through the trees, I could faintly hear laughter and voices emanating from Pat's residence. She was likely standing in her living room, brandishing fabricated documents and inciting the crowd. I envisioned her speech. "If the county won't act, we will. We are the guardians of this community. We cannot allow this outsider to disregard our regulations." And they would all applaud, cheering as if she had declared independence. But the next morning, her plan was confirmed. A local delivery driver who frequented my farm stopped with a package and said, "Hey, you've got some kind of neighborhood watch loading up trucks this morning. Looked like they were headed your way." I smiled. "Perfect." He frowned. "Perfect?" "Yeah," I said, sipping my coffee. "They're about to receive a lesson in boundaries." Because what Pat didn't know was that Sheriff Riggs, still residing in my guest quarters, had informed me earlier that week he was investigating a money laundering operation connected to a certain neighborhood treasurer. The case was confidential, but he required a quiet base while tracking suspicious transactions. When I mentioned the adjacent association, he raised an eyebrow. "Sycamore Glen?" "Yeah," I said. "Let's simply state their treasurer's name has surfaced in a few reports," he replied with a smirk. "But don't worry, Mike, I'm merely observing." So while Pat was orchestrating her inspection, the county sheriff was situated 50 feet from her target, working on a case that could implicate her own counsel. Irony seldom reaches such perfection. That afternoon, I finalized my preparations. I dedicated an hour to inspecting my security cameras, adjusting a few for optimal coverage. I desired clear documentation of the driveway, the gate, and the front yard. I knew they would record for their evidence, but I intended to possess my own version in crystal clear high definition. Sheriff Riggs emerged from the guest quarters as I finished. He was in jeans and a plain t-shirt, no badge visible, yet his demeanor exuded a quiet authority. "Expecting company?" he inquired. "Something like that," I replied, grinning. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head. "You have that look, Mike. The same one you wore when we pranked Vice Principal Harris back in high school." "This time it's legal," I said. "Mostly." He chuckled and returned inside to his files. By noon, gossip was buzzing through the area. Someone had leaked Pat's mission. Apparently, she had formed a special committee for immediate property compliance. In simple terms, this meant 4 association members, 3 cameras, and a couple of inexpensive radios. They intended to march onto my land and document violations for their so-called records. Pat adored titles that sounded official. She had likely spent the entire night designing new badges for her miniature squadron. Yet I knew she wouldn't proceed without an audience. She desired this to be public. She wanted to humiliate me before everyone, so I waited. The next morning, the farm was tranquil once more. Sunlight spilled over the fields and dew on the grass shimmered like glass. I took my time with chores, mending a gate, brushing a horse, feeding the chickens. I felt no anxiety. I had weathered fiercer storms. Then around lunchtime, my phone vibrated. A neighbor texted, "Pat's leading a group to your property now. She has cameras, looks intense." I smiled to myself and replied, "Thanks, I'll have coffee brewing." From the barn, I heard the faint growl of engines. I wiped my hands on my jeans, stepped into the sunlight, and observed a dust cloud rising down the road. They were coming, 3 white pickup trucks, freshly washed, with neighborhood logos affixed to the doors as if part of a law enforcement motorcade. The sight was so ludicrous I nearly laughed aloud. The lead truck halted at my front gate, tires crunching gravel. Pat emerged in full regalia, white blazer, sunglasses, clipboard, lips compressed into that familiar expression of superiority. Behind her were her compliance officers. Stan, her husband, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent sunburn, Don, a retired security guard who took everything too gravely, and Marv, a self-appointed community volunteer who recorded everything on his phone. Pat gestured dramatically at the lock on my gate. "That is a clear violation of community access protocols." I raised an eyebrow. "Community access, Pat? This isn't a public park. It's private property." She smirked. "We shall see what the board determines." I crossed my arms, remaining calm and patient. "Pat, for the 100th time, I am not a member of your association." She turned to her crew, disregarding me completely. "All right, gentlemen, record this for documentation. If he refuses compliance, we proceed with the inspection." The cameras began rolling. I felt my temper flare, but I remained motionless. Instead, I allowed her to excavate her own grave. Every word, every action was being perfectly captured by my cameras. Stan approached the gate, holding bolt cutters. "We have our orders, ma'am," he said, glancing at Pat. "Cut it," she commanded, and just like that he did. The metal groaned, twisted, and snapped with a loud clang. The lock fell to the dirt. Pat turned back to me, triumph gleaming in her eyes. "This property is now under official neighborhood council inspection." I observed her for a long moment, then smiled. "Is that so?" She misinterpreted my calm for fear. "You can cooperate or we can escalate this matter to the authorities," she threatened. I raised an eyebrow. "Funny you should mention authorities." From the guest quarters, I detected movement through the window. Sheriff Riggs had heard the commotion. He stepped nearer to the door, curious. The sound of gravel crunching under boots filled the air as the compliance team marched toward my barn as if it were a crime scene. The absurdity was nearly laughable, but I restrained myself. The true performance was commencing, and Pat had no idea her little inspection was about to transform into a full-blown police intervention. I leaned against the porch rail, serene as ever. "All right, Pat," I said, my voice even. "Let's witness how far you're prepared to venture today." The sun blazed overhead, cameras recorded, and inside the house the sheriff's hand quietly reached for his badge. The instant those bolt cutters severed the lock, a peculiar serenity settled over me. It wasn't fear, it wasn't rage. It was the quiet fury that emerges when you comprehend precisely what is about to transpire, and you are ready to observe it unfold. Pat Whitmore, Queen of the Neighborhood Council, advanced as if leading a military assault. Her heels clicked against the dirt road, her white blazer radiant under the harsh noon sun. Behind her compliance team strutted with purpose, clipboards in one hand, cameras in the other, documenting every move as if uncovering a major crime scene. "Spread out." She barked, waving a manicured hand. "Inspect the barn, the sheds, document everything. He's been operating illicitly for months." Stan, her husband, puffed out his chest and started toward the barn. "Copy that, ma'am," he said, attempting to sound official. I didn't move. I merely leaned on the porch railing, coffee cup in hand, and observed the circus parade onto my land. "Pat," I stated evenly, "I'd advise you to stop, but honestly this is too entertaining." She turned, eyes blazing behind her sunglasses. "You believe this is a jest? You've ignored every notice, every citation, every request from the board." I smiled. "That's because your neighborhood council holds no authority here." She ignored me and signaled to Don, the ex-security guard, to begin filming the barn. He raised his phone as if capturing footage for a true crime documentary. They stomped through the yard, muttering amongst themselves, pointing at my tractors, water tanks, and fence posts. I heard Stan remark, "Appears to be unpermitted structures, all of it." I couldn't suppress a chuckle. You do realize you're confessing to trespassing on private land on camera. That's an actual crime, unlike your fabricated violations. Pat spun around, her expression contorted with indignation. We possess authority. You cannot continue hiding behind your paperwork. Authority, I said softly. You're a neighborhood council president, not a SWAT team. A few neighbors had congregated along the fence line by then. Phones were raised, people whispered. Even from a distance I could discern the mixture of amusement and disbelief on their faces. Pat noticed, and that only fortified her determination to perform. Stan, she shouted, open that side gate. We'll inspect the barn first. I tilted my head slightly toward the barn where the large double doors were securely shut. You may wish to reconsider that, I said, but of course she didn't heed. Stan grabbed the latch and pulled. Locked. He turned to Pat. It's secured. Then cut it, she snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. He hesitated. Pat, perhaps we should cut it, Stan. He sighed and raised the bolt cutters again. The sun glinted off the steel blades as he positioned them around the latch. That was when the barn door creaked open from the inside. The entire patrol froze. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by sunlight streaming through the rafters, was Sheriff Tom Riggs, 62, broad-shouldered, adorned in his full county uniform. His badge gleamed in the light. The gold letters County Sheriff shone like a celestial warning. For a full 5 seconds, silence prevailed. Then Pat blinked. Who are you? He stepped forward, calm yet firm. Sheriff Riggs, ma'am, county law enforcement, and you are trespassing. Pat's face paled. Trespassing, no. No, we're conducting an inspection. Brown raised an eyebrow. Inspection under what authority? She stammered. Under neighborhood council regulations, this property is in violation of. He interrupted her, his voice low but steady. Ma'am, this property is not under your council's jurisdiction. It's private land. You and your associates have forcibly entered without permission, damaged private property, and disrupted the peace. That constitutes criminal trespass. Dan immediately dropped the bolt cutters. Don lowered his camera. Marv, the volunteer, appeared to desire invisibility. Pat, however, attempted to regain composure. This does not concern the county sheriff. This is neighborhood council business. Sheriff Riggs tilted his head. When you destroy a lock on someone's property, it becomes my business. I was exerting immense effort not to grin. I leaned casually against a porch post, savoring every second. Pat's voice cracked as she struggled to reclaim control. I insist you refrain from interfering in council matters. Riggs took one deliberate step forward. And I insist you and your compliance team cease committing felonies in broad daylight. He lifted his radio and pressed the button. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Riggs. I have a group of unauthorized individuals on private property, possible vandalism and trespass. Send a unit to County Road 12 West, Farmgate location. The color drained entirely from Pat's face. You're requesting backup for us. Ma'am, Riggs said, looking her directly in the eye. You breached someone's land with bolt cutters. What did you anticipate? A ribbon-cutting ceremony? A wave of laughter erupted from the neighbors behind the fence. I observed several individuals holding up their phones, capturing every moment. The mighty compliance team, cornered on camera under the bright afternoon sun by the very law they believed they could command. Pat's voice wavered. This is absurd. We're merely safeguarding our community. Riggs nodded slowly. And I'm safeguarding mine. The ensuing silence was heavy, the kind that presses against one's chest. Even the wind had stilled. Then in the distance came the faint wail of sirens. Pat's head jerked toward the road. 2 county cruisers were speeding down the gravel lane, churning dust. Deputies emerged as they arrived, one hand on their utility belts, expression stern. Riggs gestured toward the group. Gentlemen, these fine individuals elected to take the law into their own hands. One deputy approached Stan. Sir, do you possess any identification? Stan's hands trembled as he fumbled for his wallet. We were merely following orders. Whose orders? Stan hesitated, then looked at his wife. Pat remained silent. I could see sweat tracing a path down her neck as she realized her flawless plan was disintegrating before an audience and the law. Riggs turned to me. You all right, Mike? I nodded. Never better, Sheriff, merely enjoying the entertainment. He smirked. I presumed you might be. He then turned back to Pat. Ma'am, I require you and your team to remain here while we obtain your statements. Pat's composure finally shattered. This is harassment. You cannot detain us. I'll file a report. Riggs raised a brow. To whom? The neighborhood council board. That fractured her remaining control. You're committing an error, Sheriff. I'll sue you and him and the entire county. She screamed, pointing at both of us. Riggs didn't flinch. You are welcome to attempt that, but first you will explain why you believed it acceptable to forcibly enter private land without a warrant. The deputies began segregating the group, photographing the broken lock and tire tracks. One officer was reciting Pat's rights before she even processed it. Stan, poor fellow, merely muttered. I informed her this was unwise. I leaned closer and said softly, next time heed your husband, Pat. She glared at me, eyes burning, but uttered no further words. For once, the formidable Pat Whitmore had no script to follow. As the deputies collected evidence, Sheriff Riggs approached me and handed me my broken lock. Suppose you'll require a new one, he said. I smiled. No, Sheriff, this one is worth retaining, a memento. He laughed quietly. Reasonable enough. We both stood for a moment, observing as the compliance team sat on the grass under police supervision, their counterfeit badges and clipboards confiscated. The neighbors whispered behind the fence, recording, posting, gossiping. Pat had desired an audience, and she received one, merely not the variety she expected. The sirens faded, heat shimmered off the road, and for the first time in months my farm felt peaceful again. I looked at Riggs, who was scribbling in his notepad. "You know," I said, "your timing was impeccable." He smiled. "On occasion, justice possesses excellent timing." I nodded toward Pat, still fuming under the deputy's watchful gaze. "You believe this will finally silence her?" He glanced at her and said quietly, "No, but her situation is about to deteriorate significantly, and not for the reason she suspects." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Riggs gave me a knowing look. "Let's simply state this isn't solely about trespassing." I was unaware then, but that was the commencement of a much deeper tempest, one that would expose the foundations of Pat's little empire. And this time, daylight would conceal nothing. If there is one memory I will never forget, it is the expression on Pat's face the moment she recognized whom she had just commanded her team to confront. The instant Sheriff Riggs emerged from my barn in full uniform, her bravado collapsed more rapidly than a house of cards in a gale. She froze, one heel planted in the dirt, one hand clenching her clipboard like a shield. The bright afternoon sun struck the sheriff's gold badge, casting a dazzling reflection across the yard. The air fell utterly silent. The compliance team stood motionless like children discovered raiding the cookie jar, except this time the jar belonged to the law. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice calm yet weighty, like a man who had witnessed this brand of folly too frequently. "Mind informing me of your purpose on private land?" Pat blinked rapidly. "Private land?" He gestured around us at the fences, the crops, the barn, the farmhouse. "Yes, ma'am, this land, the one you just breached." Stan retreated a step. Marv, the cameraman, discreetly powered down his device. Only Pat maintained her stance, though her complexion had paled several shades. "This property," she stated, her voice quivering yet defiant, "is within the community boundary lines of Sycamore Glen. That grants our neighborhood council jurisdiction under our covenants." Sheriff Riggs's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ma'am, your covenants hold no validity once you cross that fence. That post there," he pointed at my wooden marker with the county seal, "denotes the limit of your jurisdiction. Everything beyond falls under unincorporated county land, meaning the sole law applicable here is mine." Pat's jaw tightened. "I've previously contacted the county office regarding this." "Then you should already possess the answer," he interjected, his voice now sharper. "You've been cautioned on multiple occasions to remain off Mr. Thompson's property." She swallowed hard, but her pride prevented retreat. "With all due respect, Sheriff, we are merely here to ensure community safety. There have been reports of illegal construction and unregistered vehicles on this property." "Reports," he repeated, his tone dipping. "From whom you?" Pat hesitated. "Well, yes. As the council president, it is my responsibility to investigate." Riggs's eyes narrowed. "Investigate? You intend trespass, damage private property, and harass a county resident?" A few neighbors watching from across the fence snickered. Someone muttered, "She's finished." Pat inflated her chest, still striving to salvage dignity. "You fail to comprehend, Sheriff. This individual has been disrespectful to the neighborhood council for months. He has jeopardized the neighborhood's harmony." I nearly expelled my coffee, laughing. "Harmony? You refer to the perpetual threats, counterfeit fines, and letters in my mailbox." She shot me a glare so venomous it could sour milk. "You have mocked the regulations that preserve this community's safety." Riggs raised a hand, halting her mid-sentence. "Ma'am, I will simplify this. You and your compliance team are in violation of multiple county statutes: destruction of property, trespassing, and potential harassment. I strongly advise cooperation before this escalates." Stan nervously raised a hand. "Sheriff, sir, I informed her this was inadvisable." Pat whirled on him. "Stanley, not now." He flinched, muttering something about sleeping on the sofa for a week. Riggs sighed. "All right, let's formalize this." He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Riggs at the Thompson farm. Dispatch 2 units for assistance. We have a group of unauthorized individuals attempting to conduct an illegal inspection on private property." The color drained from Pat's face. "You're summoning backup for this? We are merely volunteers." "Volunteers who breached private land," he said. "That remains a crime, last I verified." Her voice turned shrill. "This is a misunderstanding. You cannot arrest us for endeavoring to assist the community." Riggs fixed her with a cold, level stare. "Ma'am, I can arrest you precisely for your actions: breaking and entering, destruction of property, and impersonating an officer. If you do not cease the patrol, act immediately." That final statement struck her like a physical blow. "Impers, we are not impersonating." He gestured at the men behind her. "Reflective vests, radios, badges labeled security, vehicles marked compliance. What does that resemble to you?" Doan, the ex-security guard, promptly tore off his vest and mumbled, "I am not affiliated with them." Marv dropped his clipboard as if it were radioactive. Pat glanced around and realized she was suddenly standing alone in her crusade. Her voice cracked, but she attempted to sound authoritative. "This is not concluded. I will consult my attorney." "Excellent," Riggs said calmly. "You will require one." At that moment, the faint sound of sirens drifted through the warm afternoon air. Within minutes, 2 county cruisers arrived, lights flashing red and blue against the golden fields. Deputies emerged, hands resting on their belts, expressions professional yet mildly amused. They could already discern this would be an anecdote for the records. "Afternoon," Sheriff one said. "What is the situation?" Riggs nodded toward Pat. Group of self-appointed neighborhood enforcers elected to breach Mr. Thompson's property, damaged a lock, trespassed, and attempted an unauthorized search. One deputy looked at Pat, who instantly adopted her most saccharine counterfeit smile. "Oh, it is entirely a misunderstanding, officer. We are merely ensuring compliance." The deputy smiled politely. "Compliance with what, ma'am?" she faltered. "With community standards." The second deputy smirked. "Community standards do not supersede county law," Stan muttered. "I told you." Pat's composure fractured again. "You cannot treat us like criminals." "I am the neighborhood council president." "And I am the sheriff," Riggs said. "Hierarchy still matters in this county." The deputies commenced taking statements, photographing the broken gate and noting the witnesses nearby. One neighbor shouted from behind the fence, "Hey, Pat, is this included in the inspection package we fund?" A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Pat's cheeks flushed crimson. She crossed her arms, standing rigid as a statue, refusing further comment. Riggs walked up beside me, hands resting easily on his belt. "Well, Mike, I believe we can confidently state the neighborhood council will not be disturbing you for a while." I chuckled. "Oh, I'm uncertain, Sheriff. You know how weeds are. They perpetually return." He grinned. "Accurate, but next time I will bring the herbicide." The tension gradually dissipated as the deputies collected the final evidence. Stan and the others were permitted to depart after a stern warning, but Pat was requested to remain for additional questioning. You could perceive her desire to scream, but her pride immobilized her. Riggs addressed her one final time. "Ma'am, regard this as your ultimate warning. If you or anyone from that council sets foot on this property again, you will confront genuine charges. Understood?" Pat's voice emerged thin and trembling. "Crystal." The deputies completed their reports and departed. The convoy of white compliance trucks trailed behind them, notably quieter than upon arrival. When the last vehicle vanished over the hill, I finally exhaled and set my coffee down. The yard was disheveled, footprints, tire tracks, a broken gate, but the ensuing silence was the most melodious sound I had heard in weeks. Sheriff Riggs joined me on the porch. He removed his hat, wiped his brow, and said, "You certainly possess a talent for maintaining an interesting existence." I laughed. "I assure you I did not orchestrate this one." He sat beside me, opening a water bottle. "You know, Mike, I have encountered all varieties. Thieves, smugglers, even an individual who considered tax evasion a sport. But neighborhood council individuals, they are a unique breed. They have greater faith in their own regulations than the actual statutes." "Inform me about it," I said. "I possess a drawer filled with violations that are meaningless." We both gazed toward the road, the dust still settling in the golden sunlight. For a moment it felt as if peace had finally been restored. But then Riggs's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful and serious. He took a long drink of water and said quietly, "You know, this might actually assist my investigation." I frowned. "Investigation? The one you mentioned previously?" He nodded. "Indeed, it appears some of the council's financial records we have been monitoring the suspicious transactions lead directly back to this vicinity." I raised an eyebrow. "You are implying Pat is involved?" He did not respond immediately. "Let's simply state her name appears more than once. This little performance she staged just provided me with a rationale to scrutinize more closely." I leaned back in my chair, the sun warm on my face. "Well," I said with a smirk, "it sounds like karma is not finished with her yet." He smiled faintly. "Not by a long shot." As the sheriff gathered his belongings and returned to the guest quarters, I glanced at the broken gate and contemplated how rapidly arrogance transforms into ruin. Pat had desired a spectacle, and she received one. But she had no conception that the authentic narrative was merely commencing. The following morning I awoke to my phone buzzing incessantly. Missed calls, text messages, a deluge of notifications from neighbors I scarcely knew. When I stepped onto the porch with a coffee, the sun was barely above the horizon, yet the world was already alert and discussing yesterday's events. Apparently, the entire confrontation had gone viral. Someone from the crowd had posted the footage of the compliance inspection on social media, and within hours it had propagated like wildfire. Every second was preserved. Pat shouting commands, Stan severing the lock, and the glorious moment Sheriff Riggs emerged from my barn like a hero in a classic film. The caption read, "HOA Karen attempts to inspect farmer, genuine sheriff intervenes." By 8 a.m., it had surpassed 50,000 views. By noon, a local news outlet was contacting me for an interview. I did not respond. I required no statements. The internet was vocalizing on my behalf. When Sheriff Riggs visited later that morning, coffee in hand, he wore a sly half-smile that indicated developments. "Have you viewed the video yet?" "Challenging to avoid," I said, nodding toward my phone. "Half the county has tagged me," he chuckled. "Pat is not accepting it gracefully. She contacted my office this morning, alleging she was illegally ambushed on camera. Then she threatened to file a complaint with the county commissioner." I raised an eyebrow. I presume the commissioner laughed. "Essentially," he said, "but it is not concluded. She is intensifying, demands a full internal review of the sheriff's department." I took a sip of coffee. "She genuinely lacks the wisdom to surrender," Riggs nodded. "Negative, and I believe her obstinacy may unveil something more significant." He retrieved a folded document from his jacket and handed it to me. This arrived late last night. Preliminary audit report from the County Finance Division. It appears the council has been transferring substantial sums into a community enhancement fund, but that account is non-existent. I unfolded the paper. You are alleging they are laundering money, he nodded, via fabricated donations and counterfeit landscaping contracts. The treasurer authorized the majority. And conjecture whose signature is on the authorization forms. I looked down. There it was, Patricia Whitmore. My jaw tightened. So throughout this period, she has been vociferating about community regulations while pilfering her own neighbors. It appears so, Riggs said, and that little exhibition she staged here will significantly facilitate my next warrant. I couldn't suppress a grin. You are stating her ego just fortified your case. Precisely. He tapped the paper. We merely require one additional component, confirmation of how those funds were transferred, the treasurer's phone records, the council's bank logs, the internal email correspondence. If we can demonstrate intent, she is terminated. I gazed across my field, observing the sun penetrate the mist. So what do you require from me? Merely continue as you are, he said. Remain calm. She has not concluded making a fool of herself. He was not mistaken. By that afternoon, Pat was active again on the council's social media page, publishing a lengthy self-righteous declaration. Yesterday's incident resulted from a severe miscommunication. The compliance team acted in good faith to ensure community safety. The sheriff's interference was unnecessary and politically motivated. Beneath that, she added another gem. We uphold our actions and will persist in protecting this community against non-compliant individuals who threaten its harmony. The comment section became a battleground. Half ridiculed her, posting memes of her face juxtaposed with police cars. Others defended her, claiming I had staged the incident. Someone even created a parody account named the Compliance Crusaders. But what Pat failed to realize was that her words were now evidence. Sheriff Riggs captured screenshots of everything and discreetly forwarded them to the county prosecutor. Later that evening, as I repaired the broken gate, a car approached my driveway. It was Stan, Pat's husband. He appeared altered, no swagger, no superiority, merely weary eyes and slumped shoulders. He emerged holding a paper bag. Peace offering, he said quietly, handing it to me. Inside were a dozen homemade biscuits. I chuckled. Stan, I did not envision you as a baker. He offered a faint smile. They're Pat's recipe. Figured I might as well utilize something she excels at. I raised an eyebrow. She is unaware of your presence, correct? He shook his head. No, but I needed to articulate something, man. She is derailed. Since assuming the council presidency, she has been obsessed with control. Every night she remains awake until midnight drafting enforcement notices. She believes she is administering a municipal government. Sounds exhausting, I said. It is, he sighed. She has been expending council funds, extravagantly contracting non-existent contractors, remunerating for community enhancements nobody ever witnesses. I attempted to inquire once and she decapitated me, stated it was classified. I glanced toward the road where the compliance trucks had departed the previous day. You realize that may extend beyond poor leadership, correct? He nodded slowly. I deduced as much. That is why I contacted the treasurer last week. Inquired about the absent funds. The following day, Pat compelled his resignation, asserted he was exhausted. Or silenced, I muttered. Stan hesitated, then met my gaze. I acknowledge she is my wife, but if the sheriff requires proof, I can provide it. I possess copies of her emails, bank receipts, the entirety. She retains everything on a flash drive, believes she is too astute to be apprehended. I stared at him. You are serious. Utterly serious. She is oblivious that I created backups. I simply desire this to cease. I contacted Riggs immediately. Within 20 minutes, an unmarked county vehicle arrived. Stan handed the sheriff a diminutive flash drive no larger than his thumb and provided a brief statement. This will suffice, Riggs said, pocketing the drive. With this we have her unequivocally. Stan merely nodded. I will pack my belongings tonight. She will not respond favorably. He departed quietly, his tires crunching gravel as the sun descended behind the hills. That night the farm was peaceful once more. Crickets chirped and the soft glow of the porch light reflected off my coffee mug. But beneath that calm I knew something monumental was approaching. Pat was not the variety to capitulate without a spectacle, and I was correct. The next morning I awoke to the sound of screeching tires. A black SUV was parked outside my gate. Pets. She stormed out in yoga pants and a hoodie, hair disheveled, eyes incandescent. You believe you have triumphed, Mike? She shouted. You believe you can humiliate me and evade consequences? I remained on the porch, arms crossed. Pat, I informed you yesterday this is not your jurisdiction. You failed to comprehend, she screamed. You have annihilated my reputation. My own spouse betrayed me because of you. I frowned. You accomplished that independently. Before she could retort, another vehicle arrived, the same unmarked county car. Sheriff Riggs emerged, accompanied by 2 deputies. Pat froze mid-sentence. Oh no, you're not perpetrating this here, Patricia Whitmore, Riggs stated calmly. You are under investigation for financial misconduct, embezzlement of council funds, and obstruction of justice. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. You possess the right to remain silent, the deputy commenced, gently taking her arm. Neighbors congregated again along the fence line, phones aloft. Pat twisted, attempting to break free. This is harassment. I will litigate against all of you. Riggs shook his head. Ma'am, you have already litigated against yourself. As they escorted her to the vehicle, the unsupportable neighborhood council president was silent. The sole sound was the soft click of handcuffs. I stood there observing the morning breeze rustle the trees. For the first instance in a prolonged period, I experienced an emotion I had not felt in months: relief. Riggs looked at me, his expression a blend of fatigue and satisfaction. "Mike, it appears justice ultimately apprehended her." I smiled faintly. "It typically does. It merely occasionally takes the scenic route." He chuckled, replacing his hat. "You would be astonished how frequently it navigates through individuals like you, stubborn, composed, and just sufficiently unconventional to record everything." The SUV departed, vanishing down the dusty road. The crowd dispersed, and for the first time since Pat relocated to Sycamore Glen, the air finally felt pure. But I was unaware that this narrative was not entirely concluded, because the deeper they delved into Pat's accounts, the more they uncovered that her council empire was concealing something far more extensive than anyone anticipated. You would assume that with Pat in handcuffs, that would have been the denouement, the ideal conclusion to a preposterous neighborhood council saga. But as Sheriff Riggs remarked that morning while observing her SUV disappear in a dust cloud, some individuals construct their own ruin, but Pat engineered an empire of it. 2 days post-arrest, I resumed my normal routine. The farm was tranquil again. No compliance trucks, no shouting, no drama. I mended the gate once more, repainted the lock post, and nearly convinced myself life had normalized. Then around noon, a black sedan pulled up. Out stepped Sheriff Riggs, his deputy, and a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. She resembled the variety who could terminate careers with a single signature. "Morning, Mike," Riggs greeted. "Trust you do not object to our impromptu visit." "Not at all," I said. "What is occurring? Is Pat litigating the clouds this time?" He smiled faintly but did not laugh. "Not precisely. We must discuss something we discovered in the investigation." The woman opened her briefcase, extracting multiple printed spreadsheets, stamped and highlighted. "I am Special Agent Lee Parker with the State Financial Crimes Division," she stated smoothly. "Sheriff Riggs mentioned you have been cooperative. I wish to express gratitude for your assistance in exposing what is now officially classified as a multi-county fraud operation." I blinked. "Multi-county?" She nodded. "It appears your neighborhood council was not merely mismanaging modest sums. They were laundering substantial amounts through fictitious community associations, multiple ones across the state. Sycamore Glen served as the central hub." Riggs contributed. "Pat was not operating solo, Mike. She was the public facade, the enforcer, but a network supports her. Developers, counterfeit maintenance contractors, even a few county officials overlooking irregularities. She antagonized individuals positioned higher than she realized." My stomach tightened. "And she had the audacity to dispatch individuals onto my land." Agent Parker smiled grimly. "That is what arrogant individuals execute when they believe themselves invulnerable." Riggs leaned on the fence post beside me. "The footage you obtained her commanding that illicit patrol, vociferating about authority before half the neighborhood, that was invaluable. The prosecutor stated it is one of the finest evidence pieces they have ever acquired to demonstrate abuse of power and intent." "So what occurs now?" I inquired. "Now," Parker said, "we construct the complete case. We have already frozen council accounts. Stan relinquished her flash drives. They are saturated with incriminating material, meeting minutes, clandestine payments, even emails coordinating compliance checks that were merely intimidation tactics." I rubbed my chin. "It sounds like she administered her counsel like a criminal syndicate." "Essentially," Riggs said. "And you were her initial target who did not capitulate." I sighed. "Figures." Parker closed her briefcase. "Sheriff, if you are concluded here, I will return to the station. The task force convenes at 3. She turned to me. "Thank you again, Mr. Thompson. You may have preserved far more individuals than you comprehend." When she departed, Riggs remained. He appeared fatigued, not the fatigue from sleep deprivation, but the variety accumulated from witnessing excessive folly in one lifetime. He leaned against the porch railing. "You know, I believe Pat genuinely perceived her actions as noble. That is the terrifying component. She believed her council badge bestowed divine authority." I nodded. "That is what transpires when power lacks limitations. You commit believing your own falsehoods." He smiled. "That is why I appreciate you, Mike. You do not tolerate anyone's nonsense. It keeps me anchored." We conversed briefly regarding crops, the climate, the investigation. Before his departure, he looked toward the residence Pat previously occupied. "She is released on bail," he said. "Do not concern yourself. She is prohibited from approaching you by judicial order, but her attorney is already reframing it as a misunderstanding." "Let her reframe," I said. "The truth requires no public relations team." He chuckled, patted my shoulder, and drove away. That night I sat on the porch observing the sunset bleed across the horizon, reflecting on all that had transpired. I was not one to exult, but a quiet satisfaction resided in knowing justice was not blind, merely patient. I contemplated Pat's downfall. She had erected her council kingdom on intimidation, control, and money. But ultimately, it was not a lawsuit, a protest, or even a scandal that dismantled her. It was her own arrogance. A week later, the full story dominated local news. Neighborhood council president arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Authorities confirmed that Sycamore Glen and several affiliates were implicated in laundering funds through fictitious development projects and maintenance contracts. The operation allegedly funneled hundreds of thousands in resident dues into personal accounts managed by council executives. A photograph accompanied the article, Pat being escorted from the courthouse, face ashen, hair disheveled, her impeccable poise supplanted by disbelief. The comments beneath were brutal. I always suspected she was dubious. She once penalized me for blue mailbox. Finally, Karma Neighborhood Council Edition. I laughed so intensely I nearly spilled my coffee. But the authentic twist arrived 2 days later. Sheriff Riggs called me early in the morning. "Mike," he said, "you will not credit this, but your name emerged in the investigation." I froze. "My name? Do not alarm yourself," he said swiftly. "You are not in jeopardy. Actually, the contrary is true." He elaborated that several wire transfers executed by the council treasurer were labeled property acquisition reimbursements. One payment listed my farm's address. Pat had fabricated a document alleging the council possessed partial maintenance rights to my land, the identical counterfeit authority she employed to justify her inspection. I whistled. "So she attempted to render it official on paper." "Precisely," Riggs said. "She believed if she could falsify ownership records and create the appearance that your land fell under council responsibility, nobody would challenge her trespassing. The county clerk's office verified those documents were entirely forged." I exhaled slowly. "She genuinely committed entirely, she did," he said. "And that is why she's not merely confronting fraud anymore. We are incorporating forgery and falsifying public records to the list. She has terminated Mike completely." For the first instance in a prolonged period, I felt no anger or frustration, merely closure. That weekend, I walked the property line with a renewed sense of peace. The sky was clear, the fences restored, and the fields glowed golden under the sunlight. No compliance patrols, no flyers, no Pat, merely tranquility. As I reached the far extremity of my land near the creek, I noticed something partially buried beneath a rock. A laminated council notice from months prior, faded and water-stained. It read, "Failure to comply with neighborhood regulations will result in immediate enforcement action." I retrieved it, laughed under my breath, and discarded it into the burn barrel. By the subsequent Monday, the story had achieved state headlines. Pat's trial was being expedited due to public attention. Prosecutors cited recorded evidence of a puberty abused my footage as a primary factor for indictment. The identical clip that originated as a humiliating council stunt had now become a justice emblem. Reporters termed it the daylight inspection. They even interviewed witnesses. One stated on camera, "We previously believed the council protected us. It turns out the authentic protector was the adjacent farmer." I did not excessively value a claim, but hearing that elicited a smile. That night Riggs called again. "Thought you would desire to know." Pat pleaded guilty to multiple charges. It appears she negotiated an agreement to identify the other participants. The entire operation is on the verge of collapse. I sat in silence for a moment, allowing it to resonate. "You know, Sheriff," I said finally, "I almost experienced pity for her." He laughed softly. "Almost?" "Yeah," I said. "She desired control so desperately. She forfeited everything, her position, her reputation, her marriage. That is a substantial price for pride." Riggs's tone turned reflective. "That is how corruption functions. It does not commence with greed. It commences with entitlement." He was correct. The next morning, the sunrise painted the fields in gold. I poured a coffee, leaned on the porch railing, and observed a pair of bluebirds alight on the fence post. The quiet hum of life had returned. No sirens, no shouting, merely peace. And somewhere behind county jail walls, Patricia Whitmore was ultimately learning that power without accountability always concludes identically, in silence. 3 months have elapsed since the daylight inspection, and existence on the farm has never been more serene. The fences are repaired, the crops are flourishing. And for the first time in years, the sound of wind rustling through the corn no longer competes with council sirens or threats. The entire Pat incident feels like an occurrence from another lifetime, one of those bizarre anecdotes shared at barbecues that nobody quite credits until they witness the footage. But occasionally a reminder surfaces. Like this morning, when the mail truck halted at the end of my driveway, I half anticipated another council letter or some fabricated fine. Instead, it was an official county envelope. Inside was a neatly typed notice confirming the dissolution of the Sycamore Glen Neighborhood Council, signed and sealed by the county clerk. The association was defunct officially, permanently. I stood there momentarily, reading it twice, then a third time before laughing aloud. The woman who once boasted of governing the entire community had managed to obliterate the entire organization from within. Irony is genuinely poetic. That same afternoon, Sheriff Riggs visited one final time. He emerged from his cruiser carrying 2 coffee cups and a familiar grin. "Figured you might appreciate hearing the final chapter," he said, handing me one. We sat on the porch together, the quiet friendship that requires no dialogue. He gazed across the fields, sunlight glinting off his badge. "Well," he said finally, "it is official. The state concluded the case this morning. Pat pleaded guilty to fraud, falsifying documents, and obstruction. She will serve a minimum of 2 years, possibly 3 if the judge is unsympathetic." I took a slow sip of coffee. "And the others, 2 board members testified against her," he said. "They negotiated agreements in exchange for cooperation. The treasurer also confronts sentencing. It appears the council was not merely laundering money. They were diverting resident dues into personal accounts for consulting fees. I whistled softly, so the council was essentially a private treasury. Exactly, and the climax, the majority of those so-called community enhancements, the new benches, landscaping, speed bumps never materialized, merely counterfeit invoices. I shook my head, and she still perceived herself as the protagonist. Riggs leaned back in his chair. That is what renders individuals like her perilous. They persuade themselves of their righteousness. It is irrelevant how erroneous they are. They perpetually believe they are rescuing the world while trampling others. I stared toward the horizon where the fields shimmered under the sun. She targeted me because I would not yield, because she could not tolerate someone she could not control. Yeah, he said, and that is why you prevailed. You never combated her with anger. You merely maintained your position calm, steadfast. Individuals like that disintegrate when they realize intimidation is ineffective. Locals commenced referring to you as the farmer who outmaneuvered the HOA. Even the county clerk mentioned it at the diner last week. Well, I said, grinning, I suppose that surpasses the individual fine for his fence. We both laughed. When he departed later that afternoon, I observed his cruiser disappear down the road. The identical road where Pat's compliance trucks once parked. The identical one where she had vociferated about community safety. Now it was quiet, peaceful, unconstrained. A few days later, I attended the new community gathering at the town hall. Not from obligation, my land remained independent, but because the new residents had invited me. The council had been replaced with a voluntary neighborhood committee, one that genuinely listened to individuals instead of dictating to them. When I entered, the room hushed for a second, then everyone smiled. A man I recognized, one of the neighbors who had filmed the inspection, stood and said, "Mike, we simply wish to express gratitude. You taught us a lesson none will forget." Shook my head modestly. All I accomplished was maintaining my lock secured, he laughed. No, you accomplished more. You demonstrated what occurs when individuals cease questioning authority. You reminded us that regulations only signify something when they are equitable. That impacted me more profoundly than anticipated. We spent the subsequent hour discussing authentic enhancements, repairing the park swing, assisting the elderly couple down the road repaint their fence, organizing monthly socials. It was community in its truest essence, devoid of power struggles or paperwork. As the gathering concluded, one of the new committee members, Linda, my neighbor who had cautioned me months prior, handed me a framed photograph. It was a still from the viral video, Pat screaming at the gate while the sheriff emerged from the barn, hand on his badge. Beneath it, someone had inscribed a caption in bold letters, "Respect boundaries." I laughed until my eyes moistened. "You are all terrible," I said, wiping a tear. "Perhaps," Linda said, "but you earned it." When I returned home that night, I hung the photograph in my barn directly above the workbench. Each time I regard it, I am reminded of the distances arrogance can traverse and the distances patience can transport you. In the months since, my life has reverted to its rhythm. The fields are more verdant, the animals more placid, and the quiet feels distinct now. It is not merely silence, it is earned peace. Occasionally, I still reflect on Pat. I speculate if in that gray cell with no audience, no clipboard, and no control, she ultimately recognized her actions. Perhaps she did, perhaps not. But regardless, I learned something she never did. Power does not derive from titles or regulation. It derives from executing what is correct, even when inconvenient. It derives from understanding your boundaries and defending them with integrity, not ego. And perhaps, merely perhaps, it derives from retaining your sense of humor when chaos materializes at your gate wielding a clipboard. You perceive everyone. Life will perpetually harbor its Pats. The individuals who believe authority grants them the privilege to transgress others. They will assay your patience, challenge your peace, and occasionally make you question if executing the right action is even valuable. But here is the verity. Standing firm does not invariably signify combat. Occasionally, it signifies waiting composedly, quietly, until the truth articulates for itself. When someone misuses their power, they are already excavating their own cavity. You need not propel them inward. You merely must ensure you are positioned sufficiently distant to avoid collapsing with them. So if someone attempts to govern your life, your labor, or your peace, recall this narrative. Recall the farmer who confronted a neighborhood council president, not with anger or vengeance, but with a camera, a steady hand, and a sheriff who merely happened to be in the optimal location at the optimal time, because justice does not always roar. Occasionally, it merely emerges from a barn in broad daylight and simply states, "You're trespassing." What about you? Have you ever encountered a Pat who attempted to transgress the line? Inform me in the comments below.